The morning sun cast long shadows across Pinewood Avenue as Thomas Wilson carried the last of his moving boxes into his new home. A tall man with kind eyes and an impressive presence, Thomas had spent years climbing the ranks of the justice system, recently becoming the nation's Attorney General. Few in this quiet suburban neighborhood knew about his important job, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow and looked down at Rex, his golden retriever who was happily exploring the front yard. "What do you think, buddy? Is this home now?" Rex wagged his tail excitedly, circling around Thomas before running to sniff at the flower beds. The neighborhood seemed perfect, beautiful old trees lining the streets, well-kept gardens, and neighbors who had already stopped by with welcome baskets and friendly smiles, all except one. Across the street lived Patricia Miller, a woman in her 60s who had watched Thomas's moving truck arrive with narrowed eyes and a tight frown. When other neighbors came to introduce themselves, Patricia stayed behind her curtains, peeking out occasionally with obvious disapproval. "Don't worry about Mrs. Miller," said Robert Chen, the retired teacher next door, as he helped Thomas unpack his kitchen. "She's been that way since her husband passed. Keeps to herself mostly." But Thomas had seen that look before. 20 years practicing law had taught him to recognize prejudice when he saw it. Still, he wasn't one to judge without giving people a chance. The next morning, Thomas decided to make the first move. He baked a loaf of banana bread using his grandmother's recipe and walked across the street with Rex walking politely beside him. He knocked on Patricia's door, straightening his casual weekend sweater and practicing his friendliest smile. Patricia opened the door just enough to see who it was. Her gaze immediately dropped to Rex, then back to Thomas, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Good morning," Thomas said warmly. "I'm Thomas Wilson, your new neighbor from across the street. I thought I'd bring over some homemade banana bread as a hello." Patricia stared at the bread without taking it. "I'm not interested in making new friends," she said flatly. Her eyes darted to the street behind him. "And keep that dog off my lawn. I don't want it doing its business on my property." Rex sat quietly beside Thomas, the perfect picture of good behavior. "I understand," Thomas said, maintaining his smile despite her coldness. "Rex is very well trained, but I'll be sure to keep him away from your yard. The offer of bread still stands if you change your mind." Patricia shut the door without another word. As the weeks passed, Thomas settled into a comfortable routine. In the early mornings before heading to his office, he would jog through the neighborhood with Rex. Evenings found him sitting on his porch, reviewing case files while Rex lounged at his feet. He made friends with most of the families on the block, often hosting small gatherings in his backyard. But Patricia's attitude only worsened. She would change direction if she saw Thomas coming, cross the street to avoid passing him on the sidewalk. When other neighbors invited her to events at Thomas's house, she refused, making comments about the neighborhood changing and property values dropping. One Saturday, Thomas was tending to his garden when he heard Patricia's sharp voice. "Your dog was barking all night. Some of us need our sleep." Thomas looked up, confused. "Rex was inside with me all night. He rarely barks." "I know what I heard," Patricia insisted, though Mrs. Lee next door, who was watering her flowers, shook her head slightly at Thomas. Thomas chose not to argue. "I'm sorry you were disturbed. If you hear barking again, please let me know right away so I can address it." Patricia stormed off, muttering under her breath. That evening, while Thomas grilled chicken for dinner, Robert came by with a warning. "Be careful around Patricia," he said quietly. "She's been asking questions about you, saying strange things at the neighborhood council meeting. I think she's trying to find reasons to file complaints." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, watching Rex play in the yard. Despite his important position, Thomas valued his privacy and the peaceful life he was trying to build here. He had dealt with difficult people throughout his career, but something about Patricia's hostility felt more personal, more dangerous. Little did he know just how far Patricia's hatred would take her, or that his quiet life in this peaceful neighborhood was about to change dramatically. The first month in the new house passed quickly for Thomas. His job kept him busy with long hours at the office, but he always made time for Rex, whose happy face greeted him at the door each evening. The neighborhood had become a true home to him, all except for the growing problem with Patricia Miller. It started with small things. Thomas would find his mail scattered across his lawn, as if someone had rifled through it. Twice, his garbage cans were tipped over on collection day. At first, he blamed the wind or maybe raccoons, until Robert showed him footage from his doorbell camera of Patricia deliberately knocking over Thomas's recycling bin before hurrying back to her house. "I don't understand what I did to make her dislike me so much," Thomas said, watching the video with a frown. Robert sighed. "It's not about anything you did, Thomas. Some people just can't see past their own narrow views." The situation took a more serious turn when Thomas began finding formal complaints against him in his mailbox. Patricia had reported him to the Homeowners Association for violations that other neighbors were never cited for: his grass being half an inch too tall, leaving his porch light on too late, or Rex's occasional barking, which several neighbors insisted they never heard. One evening, Thomas was finishing up dinner when there was an angry knock at his door. He opened it to find Patricia standing there with a city official beside her. "This is Mr. Henderson from Animal Control," Patricia announced, her voice sharp with triumph. "I'd filed a complaint about your dangerous dog." Thomas looked at Rex, who was calmly sitting in the living room watching them with curious eyes. "Dangerous?" Thomas asked, genuinely confused. "Rex has never shown aggression to anyone." Mr. Henderson looked uncomfortable. "We received a complaint that your dog charged at Ms. Miller and nearly bit her." "That's absolutely false," Thomas said firmly. "Rex is trained and gentle. He's never off-leash outside our yard, and he's never charged at anyone." "He's lying," Patricia cut in. "That dog is a menace to the neighborhood." "I have witnesses." By now, several neighbors had noticed the commotion and gathered nearby. Mrs. Lee stepped forward. "I've lived next door since Thomas moved in," she said. "That dog is the sweetest animal I've ever met. My grandchildren play with him all the time." One by one, other neighbors spoke up, defending Thomas and Rex. Mr. Henderson nodded, making notes, clearly seeing through Patricia's false claims. "I'll need to file a report," he said finally, "but based on neighborhood testimony, I don't see any evidence supporting the complaint." Patricia's face flushed with anger. "You're all taking his side because you're afraid to speak up. That dog is dangerous, and he doesn't belong here." Everyone knew she wasn't just talking about the dog. After they left, Thomas sat on his porch, troubled by the escalation. He pulled out his phone and began documenting everything that had happened so far. As the Attorney General, he had seen how unchecked harassment could escalate into something worse. The next day, Thomas installed security cameras around his property. He didn't want to believe Patricia would do anything truly harmful, but his years in law enforcement had taught him to be cautious. At work, Thomas was leading a major investigation into corruption cases and civil rights violations across the state. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him, fighting for justice during the day while facing discrimination in his own home. A week later, while Thomas was working in his front garden with Rex lounging in the shade nearby, Patricia walked past with two friends, speaking loudly enough for him to hear. "Property values have dropped 15% since certain elements moved in," she said, glancing pointedly at Thomas. "The neighborhood just isn't what it used to be." Thomas straightened up, dirt on his hands from planting new flowers. He considered confronting her, but decided against it. Instead, he watched as Rex stood up, wagging his tail, and trotted over to the fence to greet Patricia's friends, who couldn't help but smile at the friendly dog. That evening, Thomas noticed Patricia watching his house from behind her curtains. The intensity of her stare sent a chill down his spine. Something in her eyes told him that her hatred was building towards something dangerous, and he couldn't shake the feeling that both he and Rex needed to be very careful. The weather had turned unusually warm for October. Thomas had been working on a difficult case all week, staying late at the office most nights. Today, he had promised himself he would leave early to spend time with Rex in the backyard. As Thomas pulled into his driveway, he smiled at the sight of his home. Despite Patricia's continued hostility, he had grown to love this place. The neighbors, except for Patricia, had become like family. Mrs. Lee often brought over homemade dumplings, and Robert had helped Thomas build a small deck where he could sit and read in the evenings while Rex played in the yard. "Come on, buddy," Thomas called as he opened the back door. Rex usually came running with excited barks, but today there was no response. Thomas felt a flutter of worry in his chest. Rex. He walked through the house, calling for his dog. When he reached the kitchen, he spotted Rex lying on his side near the water bowl. The dog's breathing was rapid and shallow, and a puddle of vomit lay beside him. Rex. Thomas rushed to his dog's side. Rex tried to wag his tail at the sight of his owner, but he was clearly in pain. When Thomas touched him, the dog whimpered. Fear gripped Thomas as he carefully lifted his beloved pet. "Hold on, buddy. We're going to get you help." The drive to the emergency vet clinic was a blur. Thomas ran every red light, his heart pounding as Rex's condition worsened in the backseat. By the time they arrived, Rex was barely conscious. "Please help him," Thomas pleaded as veterinary technicians rushed out with a stretcher. "Something's terribly wrong with him." Dr. Patel, a kind-faced woman with quick, efficient movements, examined Rex immediately. "His symptoms suggest poisoning," she said grimly. "Did he eat anything unusual today?" Thomas shook his head, then froze as a terrible thought struck him. I have security cameras. Let me check the footage." While the vet team worked to save Rex's life, Thomas sat in the waiting room, his hands trembling as he pulled up the security app on his phone. He scrolled back through the day's footage until he spotted movement near his backyard fence around noon. The video showed Patricia approaching the fence, looking around furtively before tossing something into Thomas's yard. The camera angle shifted to show Rex finding the item, what looked like a piece of meat, and eating it before Thomas could return home. "Oh my God," Thomas whispered, his blood running cold. He immediately called the police. Officer Daniels arrived at the vet clinic 30 minutes later. Thomas showed him the footage, his voice shaking with both anger and fear. "I want to press charges," Thomas said. "She deliberately poisoned my dog." Officer Daniels nodded gravely. "We'll need the vet's report to confirm the poisoning, but this footage is compelling evidence. I'll send a team to talk to her right away." Thomas paced the waiting room for 3 agonizing hours before Dr. Patel emerged from the treatment area, looking tired but relieved. "We've stabilized him," she said. "The toxicology report shows he ingested antifreeze, which is extremely dangerous for dogs. We've given him the antidote and started dialysis to protect his kidneys. The next 24 hours will be critical, but he's fighting hard." Thomas felt tears burning his eyes. "He's going to make it." "I believe so," Dr. Patel said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "He's strong, and we caught it relatively early. Someone wanted to hurt him, but not enough to use a lethal dose. That probably saved his life." After making sure Rex was settled for the night, Thomas drove home in a daze of exhaustion and anger. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw police cars parked outside Patricia's house. Officer Daniels was leading her to a patrol car in handcuffs, while neighbors watched from their porches. Patricia caught sight of Thomas and yelled across the street, "You have no proof. It's your word against mine." Thomas didn't respond. He simply watched as Officer Daniels guided her into the backseat of the police car. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept checking his phone for updates from the vet clinic and replaying the security footage in his mind. How could someone deliberately harm an innocent animal? The question haunted him as he sat alone in his quiet house, missing Rex's comforting presence. His phone rang just after midnight. It was Dr. Patel. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "I thought you'd want to know. Rex is showing improvement. His vital signs are stronger, and he's responding well to treatment." For the first time since finding Rex collapsed on the kitchen floor, Thomas felt hope. As he hung up the phone, he made a silent promise to his loyal companion. Justice would be served. Thomas spent the next 3 days at the veterinary clinic, only leaving Rex aside to shower and change clothes. The loyal dog was slowly improving, but still needed constant medical care. Neighbors brought Thomas food and coffee, offering support during the difficult time. On the 4th morning, Thomas was dozing in a chair beside Rex's kennel when his phone rang. It was Officer Daniels. "Mr. Wilson, we need you to come to the station today if possible. Detective Rivera wants to talk to you about your case against Patricia Miller." Thomas gently stroked Rex's head before leaving. "I'll be back soon, buddy. The doctors will take good care of you." At the police station, Thomas was led to a small conference room where a sharp-eyed woman in a crisp suit waited for him. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Detective Rivera," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "I've been assigned to your case. How's your dog doing?" "Better," Thomas said, the relief evident in his voice. "The vet thinks he'll make a full recovery." "That's good news," she said with a genuine smile before becoming serious again. "We've collected significant evidence against Ms. Miller. The lab confirmed the meat found in your yard contained antifreeze, and we have the security footage showing her throwing it over your fence." Thomas nodded, his jaw tight. "And what is she saying?" Detective Rivera sighed. "She's denying everything, claiming she was just throwing away trash that blew into your yard. She's also making some concerning statements." "What kind of statements?" Thomas asked, though he could guess. "She's claiming you're trying to frame her because she complained about your dog. She says you're using connections to target her." Detective Rivera looked uncomfortable. "She's made several comments suggesting this is all about race." Thomas wasn't surprised. "And what happens now?" "We're charging her with animal cruelty and trespassing. Given her statements and your security footage showing a pattern of behavior, we're also looking at possible hate crime charges." As they discussed the case details, Thomas provided the detective with his documented history of Patricia's harassment. He also mentioned his job without specifying his exact role, simply stating he worked for the Department of Justice. "We'll need you to testify if this goes to trial," Detective Rivera explained. "Are you prepared for that?" Thomas nodded firmly. "Absolutely. I want justice for Rex." Later that afternoon, Thomas stopped by his office to pick up some files he could work on while staying with Rex at the clinic. His assistant, Lily, rushed up to him as he entered. "Everyone's been so worried. How's Rex doing?" News traveled fast in the office. Though Thomas kept his personal life private, his colleagues knew how much his dog meant to him. "He's getting better," Thomas said. "But I need to work from the vet clinic for a few more days." "Of course," Lally said, handing him a stack of folders. "The governor called about the Hamilton corruption case, and there's a press conference scheduled next week about the Civil Rights Initiative." Thomas thanked her and headed back to the clinic, unaware that across town, Patricia was being released on bail. Patricia sat stiffly in her living room while her daughter, Karen, paced back and forth. "Mom, do you realize how serious this is?" Karen asked, her voice tight with stress. "Animal cruelty charges can mean jail time." "And for what?" "Because you don't like your neighbor." "You don't understand," Patricia insisted. "That man doesn't belong here. He's ruining our neighborhood." Karen stopped pacing to stare at her mother. "Do you even know anything about him? His name? His job? Anything besides the color of his skin?" Patricia looked away. "I don't need to know anything else." Karen grabbed her purse from the couch. "I'm going to find you a lawyer, Mom. A good one, because you're going to need it." After her daughter left, Patricia turned on the local news, trying to distract herself from her mounting troubles. The lead story featured the state's attorney general announcing a major breakthrough in a corruption investigation. Patricia barely glanced at the screen as Thomas Wilson appeared, looking authoritative in a perfectly tailored suit, addressing a room full of reporters. She turned off the TV and went to bed, completely unaware that the man she had been harassing, the man whose dog she had poisoned, was one of the most powerful legal figures in the state. 1 week after the poisoning, Rex was finally well enough to come home. Thomas carried his still weak dog into the house, carefully setting him on his favorite bed in the living room. The loyal retriever looked up at Thomas with tired eyes, but managed to wag his tail. "You're safe now," Thomas whispered, gently stroking Rex's head. "No one's going to hurt you again." The doorbell rang, and Thomas opened it to find Robert and Mrs. Lee standing there with a large welcome home basket for Rex. Inside were homemade dog treats, new toys, and a soft blanket. "The whole neighborhood pitched in," Robert explained. "Everyone's been so worried about him." Mrs. Lee nodded. "My grandson made this card." She handed Thomas a colorful handmade card covered in dog stickers and childish handwriting that read, "Get well, Rex." Thomas was deeply touched by his neighbor's kindness. After they left, he sat beside Rex, thinking about the court dates set for the following week. Patricia's case had been assigned to Judge Howard, known for his fair but firm approach. Thomas had appeared before him many times in his career. The next morning, Thomas received a call from Detective Rivera. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. Patricia Miller is claiming she can't get a fair trial because of your connections. Her lawyer is trying to get the case moved to another county. Thomas sighed. She still doesn't know who I am, does she? Apparently not, Detective Rivera replied. She just knows you work for the Department of Justice in some capacity. Her lawyer seems equally in the dark. Thomas thought for a moment. Let's proceed as planned. The truth will come out in court. 3 days later, Patricia sat nervously beside her lawyer in the courthouse waiting room. She had chosen to wear her most conservative outfit, a navy blue dress with a pearl necklace, hoping to make a good impression. Remember, her lawyer whispered, let me do all the talking. The evidence doesn't look good, but I think we can argue that there was no malicious intent. Patricia nodded, clutching her handbag tightly. That's when she noticed a commotion at the end of the hallway. A group of people were walking quickly toward the courtroom, surrounded by what looked like security personnel. What's happening? Patricia asked her lawyer. Before he could answer, the crowd parted, and Patricia saw Thomas walking confidently down the hallway. But instead of the casual clothes she was used to seeing him in, he wore an impeccable dark suit. People nodded respectfully as he passed, some even stepping back to make way. Patricia's lawyer suddenly stood straighter. That's... Oh no. What? Patricia demanded. Who is he? Her lawyer turned to her, his face pale. That's Thomas Wilson, the Attorney General. Patricia felt the blood drain from her face. The what? The Attorney General, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the state, her lawyer explained in a strained whisper. He oversees all state legal matters and reports directly to the governor. He's one of the most powerful legal figures in the country. Patricia stared in disbelief as Thomas stopped to speak with Judge Howard, the two men clearly familiar with each other. Several other attorneys approached Thomas, shaking his hand with obvious respect. That can't be him, Patricia whispered. He's just my neighbor with the dog. Your neighbor is the Attorney General, her lawyer confirmed grimly. And you poisoned his dog. Patricia's legs gave way, and she collapsed back into her seat. The magnitude of her actions suddenly hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't just targeted an ordinary man. She had attacked the pet of someone with the power to bring the full force of the justice system down upon her. As if sensing her realization, Thomas looked over at that moment. Their eyes met across the crowded hallway. There was no triumph in his gaze, no smugness, just a calm, steady look that somehow made Patricia feel even worse. Her lawyer leaned down. We need to change our strategy, immediately. I'm going to try to negotiate a plea deal before this gets any worse. But Patricia barely heard him. She was watching Thomas greet Detective Rivera with a warm handshake before they entered the courtroom together. Around her, people were whispering and pointing in her direction, the story of the woman who poisoned the Attorney General's dog spreading quickly through the courthouse. For the first time since this all began, Patricia felt something she had never expected to feel: shame. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Howard entered. Patricia sat stiffly beside her lawyer, still reeling from the discovery of Thomas's identity. She couldn't stop staring at him across the room, trying to reconcile the neighbor she had harassed with the powerful figure now sitting confidently at the prosecution table. All rise for the Honorable Judge Howard, the bailiff announced. As the proceedings began, Patricia's lawyer immediately requested a private conference with the prosecutor and judge. The three disappeared into the judge's chambers, leaving Patricia alone with her thoughts. 20 minutes later, they returned, and her lawyer leaned over to whisper to her. The Attorney General's office is willing to offer a deal, he said quietly. Given the circumstances, it's better than we could have hoped for. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, we've reached an agreement with the defendant. Ms. Miller will plead guilty to animal cruelty and trespassing. In exchange, we recommend 6 months of house arrest, a $5,000 fine to be donated to the animal shelter of Mr. Wilson's choice, and mandatory participation in a community education program on diversity and inclusion. Patricia's jaw dropped. She had expected jail time, especially now that she understood who Thomas was. Her lawyer nudged her to stand. Ms. Miller, do you accept these terms? Judge Howard asked. Yes, Your Honor, Patricia stammered. Judge Howard looked at Thomas. Mr. Attorney General, do you find these terms acceptable? Thomas stood. Yes, Your Honor. The state's interest is not in punishment for its own sake, but in justice and rehabilitation. I believe these terms serve that purpose. The judge nodded. Very well, Ms. Miller, I am accepting this plea agreement, but I want to be clear about something. What you did was not just an attack on a pet. It was an act of hatred, and such behavior has no place in our society. Patricia lowered her head, unable to meet the judge's stern gaze. You will begin your house arrest tomorrow, Judge Howard continued. The education program starts next week. And Ms. Miller? He waited until she looked up. Consider yourself fortunate that Mr. Wilson has shown such remarkable restraint and compassion in this matter. As the court adjourned, Patricia watched Thomas being approached by reporters in the hallway. She expected him to denounce her to the press, to make an example of her. Instead, she overheard him saying, "This case is about more than one incident or one person. It's about acknowledging that prejudice still exists in our communities and finding ways to address it constructively." Patricia's daughter Karen waited for her outside the courtroom. "You got lucky, Mom," Karen said as they walked to the car. "Do you understand that?" Patricia nodded silently. For days, she had expected Thomas to use his considerable power to crush her. Instead, he had shown mercy. That thought kept her awake that night, staring at the ceiling as she tried to understand why. The story made the local news that evening. Patricia watched from her living room as Thomas appeared on screen, Rex sitting calmly by his side. The dog looked remarkably recovered, his golden coat shining under the lights. "As Attorney General, I see firsthand how hatred can tear communities apart," Thomas was saying. "But I also believe in our capacity to learn and grow. That's why I supported a resolution that includes education rather than just punishment." The reporter asked about Rex's condition. Thomas smiled, patting the dog's head. "He's doing great. Dogs have an amazing capacity for forgiveness, sometimes more than people do." The following week, Patricia reluctantly attended her first session of the community education program. She sat in the back row, hoping to remain unnoticed. The instructor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Chen, began by asking each person to share what brought them there. When Patricia's turn came, she hesitated before admitting, "I poisoned my neighbor's dog because I didn't want him in my neighborhood." "And why didn't you want him there?" Dr. Chen asked gently. Patricia started to give an excuse but then stopped herself. For the first time, she forced herself to face the ugly truth. "Because of the color of his skin," she said, her voice barely audible. Dr. Chen nodded. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward change," she said, "and change is always possible." As Patricia left the session that day, she noticed a familiar car parked across the street. Thomas was walking Rex on a leash, the dog moving more slowly than before, but with a wagging tail. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Thomas gave a small nod before continuing on his way. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. 6 months passed. The maple trees on Pinewood Avenue changed from summer green to autumn gold and then stood bare against the winter sky. Spring brought new beginnings, with fresh buds and birdsong filling the neighborhood once again. Thomas sat on his newly expanded back deck, watching Rex chase butterflies in the yard. The dog had made a complete recovery, though he moved a bit slower than before. The veterinarians had warned there might be some lasting kidney damage, but Rex's spirit remained unbroken. "He looks happy," said Robert, who had stopped by with a plate of his famous barbecue ribs. "He is," Thomas agreed. "We both are." The neighborhood had changed over the past months. After the story made local and then national news, people from surrounding communities had reached out, organizing neighborhood gatherings focused on building unity. Thomas had spoken at several of these events, sharing his experience while emphasizing the importance of compassion and growth. Patricia had completed her house arrest 2 weeks earlier. Throughout those 6 months, she had faithfully attended every session of the community education program, gradually moving from the back row to a seat closer to the front. As the weeks passed, she had begun to speak more during discussions, sometimes even sharing painful realizations about her own upbringing and the prejudices she had never questioned. Thomas hadn't spoken directly with her since the court case, but he had heard from Dr. Chen that Patricia was genuinely engaging with the program. That afternoon, as Thomas worked in his front garden while Rex napped nearby, A car pulled up across the street. Patricia stepped out, followed by her daughter Karen. Thomas noticed Patricia hesitate before Karen gently encouraged her forward. Together, they crossed the street toward him. Thomas stood, brushing soil from his hands. Rex raised his head, watching curiously but without fear. "Mr. Wilson," Patricia began, her voice unsteady. I wanted to speak with you, if that's all right." Thomas nodded. "Of course." Karen stepped back, giving them space. Patricia clutched a small envelope in her hands. "I've been trying to write you a letter for weeks," she said, "but everything I wrote seemed insufficient." She looked down at Rex. "What I did was unforgivable. Not just poisoning your dog, but all of it, the way I treated you from the moment you moved in." Thomas remained silent, letting her continue. "The program taught me to look at my own thoughts, my own history. I grew up in a different time, but that's no excuse." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I haven't earned that. But I wanted you to know that I'm truly sorry, and I'm trying to change." She handed him the envelope. "This is for the animal shelter. It's more than the court required. I want them to use it to help animals who've been abused." Thomas accepted the envelope with a nod. "Thank you for telling me this in person. That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Patricia admitted. "But Dr. Chen says growth happens outside our comfort zones." A small smile crossed Thomas's face. "She's right about that." As Patricia turned to leave, Rex stood up and slowly walked over to her. Everyone froze, waiting to see what would happen. The dog sniffed her hand, then sat calmly, looking up at her. Patricia looked questioningly at Thomas, who nodded. She carefully reached down and patted Rex's head. The dog's tail wagged gently against the grass. "He's a better person than most people," Thomas said quietly. 2 weeks later, Thomas hosted a neighborhood barbecue. As children played games on his lawn and adults chatted on the deck, he noticed Patricia and Karen arriving, a dish of potato salad in Karen's hands. Some neighbors fell silent, watching uncomfortably. Thomas walked over to greet them. "Glad you could make it," he said, loud enough for others to hear. He showed them where to put the potato salad, then introduced them to Mrs. Lee and her family. Later, as the sun began to set, Thomas found himself standing next to Dr. Chen, who had also been invited. "You know," she said, watching Patricia cautiously talking with a young couple who had recently moved in, "most people wouldn't have given her this chance." Thomas looked around at his diverse neighborhood gathered together on his lawn. Rex was lying contentedly in the middle of a circle of children who were gently petting him. "Change is hard," Thomas replied. "But if we don't believe it's possible, what hope do any of us have?" As twilight softened the edges of the day, the neighborhood of Pinewood Avenue continued its own journey of healing, imperfect and ongoing, but moving forward together.